From Oregon governor to the balance of power in Congress, this midterm election will change the political landscape of the state and the nation. So what did this election tell us about what voters want locally and nationally? Here to talk about that and more is our friend Ben Gaskins, political science professor at Lewis and Clark College. Professor Gaskins, welcome to Eye on Northwest Politics.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we just talked about charter reform, and briefly I want to get your take on why this measure passed this time after it failed so many times in years past.
Well, I think there's just a state of overall discontent with the status quo in Portland, Multnomah County, and elsewhere. And that makes it easier, I think, to pitch a change, any change, to what that status quo looks like. And so, there is a good reason for this charter to be supported right now. We've seen movements across the country to go towards ranked choice voting and moving away from majoritarian elections because it will lead to better representation. And I think that is an incentive. It's something that voters are really looking for now and made this alternative very popular.
Looking at elections not only here but across the country, were there any big picture themes that stood out to you?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest issues is that we have a lot of discontentment across the country with the state of affairs, but that the party to be blamed was pretty inconsistent. That we saw, there's not necessarily a huge amount of satisfaction with the Democratic Party nationwide. President Joe Biden's approval ratings are fairly low, but the alternative, for the most part, Republicans are not that much higher in terms of their support. And so voters are caught in a little bit of a conundrum if they're unhappy with the status quo, but also not in favor of the main alternative. What are they going to do? And I think that led to a lot of incumbents winning, more than we would have expected, given the popularity of the incumbent party overall. And the fact that even with the kind of discontent that we see in the state of Oregon, Oregon voters still voted to elect a Democratic governor, very much in keeping with Kate Brown. And so that discontentment didn't necessarily get represented by electoral outcomes, but it still, I think, was very visible across the country and led to some fairly surprising outcomes in some races that were expected to go one way, but ultimately did not.
To your point, the red wave didn't happen as many people anticipated. Republicans did make some inroads in Congress. So what happened to that red wave? And does this say anything about the Trump influence weakening politically?
I think that's a big part of it. I think there are two main factors that really prevented this red wave from appearing. The first is this Dobbs decision earlier in the summer that overturned Roe v. Wade. I think that provided something to really mobilize the Democratic electorate and even reach out to voters that tend to not show up at midterms, especially younger voters, to show up and vote for Democrats this go around. And secondly, Donald Trump represents still a polarizing national figure, and the pitch that Democrats had that this election was about protecting democracy and protecting the country from more extremist Republican candidates resonated again with a lot of Democratic voters and mobilized them to show up and vote. And so that was really kind of the surprising element, that you would expect this election to be a referendum on the incumbent party, and to some degree it was, but those countervailing forces really led to this fairly singular electoral result where the incumbent party did far better than the fundamentals would predict based on the economy, the rate of inflation, and just the general unpopularity with the Democratic Party. So it was a very surprising night, and there are, again, a lot of factors at play here that prevented this from really going one way or the other politically.
We had several congressional races in this region that attracted significant outside attention. I'm thinking about Erickson versus Salinas in Oregon's new 6th, Chavez-DeRemer versus McLeod-Skinner in the 5th, Gluesenkamp-Perez versus Joe Kent in the Washington 3rd Congressional District. How do you feel those races fit into the national equation?
Well, I think they are in many ways a microcosm of what is going on nationally, that there are a lot of independent voters that are feeling cross-pressure between the Democratic and Republican parties, that with Oregon gaining a congressional district, it's harder to pack the Democratic majority into those seats, which means that there is going to be more competition, especially in Oregon's 5th and 6th districts that would have otherwise been fairly safely Democratic are now much more up in the air. And they are subject to many of these same national forces that we're seeing across the country, where there are a lot of really close races between especially incumbent Democrats and Republican challengers. So that's, I think, what's going on in Oregon, especially to see, can the Democrats really use gerrymandering to consolidate their power, to go from having 4 Democratic representatives to 5, or are they going to be stuck at 4? And for Washington 3rd, again, that's another microcosm of this nationwide conversation of how more extreme Republicans are able to pick up seats that are in more swingy districts. Washington's 3rd is a seat that should be safely Republican and would be if there was Jamie Herrera Butler still in the race, or a more moderate Republican. But with a more kind of Trumpy Republican, it becomes much more of a toss-up. And right now, the Democrat is still ahead very narrowly, but could eventually pull out a race that should have been in the Republican side.
Well, last thing, in Oregon, the Democrats' control of Salem continues with Tina Kotek winning the race for governor, but getting a strong challenge from Republican Christine Drazan. Why do you think Kotek was able to pull this one out?
I think it all comes down to the fundamentals of the state, that despite the fact that, again, the incumbent governor, Kate Brown, has fairly low popularity and has for quite some time, ultimately this is a Democratic state. And the question going into election night would be how many Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents would be peeled away by Betsy Johnson. And I think that ultimately the answer is not that many. Johnson is getting in the single digits, which means that Democratic voters came home, if you will, to the Democratic candidate and voted for Tina Kotek. And so even though she's not going to run up the margin that, say, Ron Wyden did in the Senate, that underlying fundamental Democratic political identity and ideology that is growing in Oregon was just too much for Christine Drazan to overcome, especially given that she is not necessarily a moderate Republican, that there is somewhat of a limit to her crossover appeal from moderates and Democrats. And ultimately, it seemed that there's just too many Democrats in Oregon for Christine Drazan to win this race.
Professor Ben Gaskins, thanks for joining us on Eye on Northwest Politics.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you, Ken.
We'll be right back.